Okay, so now we're moving on to chapter 8, photosynthesis, which is kind of like a sister biochemical reaction to cellular respiration. It has a lot of we'll be talking about some of the same parts. We'll be talking about energy being stored in bonds. We'll be talking about electron carriers, electron transport chains, again, oxidation, reduction, those kind of things. So if you haven't watched or listened to the chapter 7 video, I encourage you to do so. Well, photosynthesis, we've heard throughout school, it's energy from the sun is captured by plants or photosynthetic organisms, and they create energy from it. And specifically, what they create is a molecule of glucose, which is just a way to store energy. And if you look at this formula here, this is really the opposite formula for cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, this arrow would be flipped around and pointed the other direction. And instead of having light, we would have created energy. And so what plants do is they take these low energy carbon dioxides plus water. Plants need water to replace electrons that they lose, and we'll see how that works, plus light from the sun, and to build, these glucose molecules, these organized glucose molecules. Photosynthesis is carried out by cyanobacteria, a type of prokaryote, 7 groups of algae, and then all land plants. So all the land plants can do photosynthesis. There are 2 stages of photosynthesis. There's the light-dependent reactions. These require light in order to work. They capture energy from the sunlight. And what they do is they make ATP and reduce NADP+, those electron carriers. Now, in respiration, it was just NAD+, but in photosynthetic organisms, they're structured a little bit different. And so they're NADP+ to NADPH, but they work pretty much the same. They carry electrons, and that's what we're going to be focusing our attention on, what they do. And then the other stage of photosynthesis is sometimes called the light-independent reactions or the carbon fixation reactions. It does not require light, but it does not require darkness either. These 2 stages used to be called the light reactions and the dark reactions, but it was kind of confusing because people assumed that the dark reactions only happened at nighttime, but they happen all the time. And what the light-independent reactions do is they take this ATP and these electron carriers that was produced here, and they make organic molecules from carbon dioxide, like glucose. Well, in land plants, photosynthesis happens in chloroplasts, and chloroplasts have a thylakoid membrane, this internal membrane that contains the chlorophyll and other pigments. They have grana, which are these stacks of flattened thylakoid membranes. There's these little things called stroma lamella that connect those grana together. And then there's the stroma, which is this semi-liquid. It's kind of a thick liquid surrounding the thylakoid membranes. And you can see the chloroplast here. It has an outer membrane, an inner membrane, these thylakoid discs, which are just membrane discs that are stacked inside of a chloroplast. And often plant cells have multiple chloroplasts in them. This is an overview of photosynthesis, and it happens here in the chloroplast, some of it on the membrane, but some of it out in the stroma too. So sunlight comes down and strikes these specific protein structures here called photosystems. There's a photosystem 2 and a photosystem 1, but this is a photosystem. And what this photosystem is doing is it's capturing a photon of light and exciting electrons here so that those electrons now have a higher energy level, and they capture that energy level to produce ATP. Right? And so that's what happens in the light reactions and in NADPH. Then NADPH and ATP use their energy to spin this Calvin cycle so that you can get organic molecules out of it. Molecules that absorb light energy in the visible range are called pigments. And in this case, pigments are important because I said, here's a photon of light coming down. Well, how do we get energy from that photon of light? And it's because of pigments. And photons act as this little discrete bundle of energy, and it's the energy of a photon is inversely proportional to the wavelength of the light. So the longer the wavelength of light, the lower energy, and the shorter wavelengths of light have a higher energy. And sometimes when a pigment gets struck, it has this thing called a photoelectric effect, where it removes an electron from a molecule because of light. And this is the electromagnetic spectrum: gamma rays, X-rays, UV light, infrared and radio waves that goes from smallest to largest. And right in the middle is visible light. And so this is what we're concerned with here, because this is the pigments that plants use. And when a photon strikes a molecule like a pigment, its energy is either lost as heat or it's absorbed by the electrons of the molecule. Now, when that happens, the electrons that absorb the energy of the photon get boosted into a higher energy level. Right? So imagine a atom. You have a nucleus. The electrons are orbiting the nucleus, and we've stated before that there are shells of electrons that extend beyond the nucleus. If an electron is in the very first shell, it's lower energy, and if it moves out shells, maybe the third or fourth shell, then it's higher energy. And so what a photon will do is it will kick an electron from a low energy state out to a high energy state. But that electron can't maintain that high energy state because it's unstable, and so it will begin to fall back down, releasing energy that the plant can then use to drive photosynthesis. These are the ranges in which, these are the different pigments like carotenoids, chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, that a plant has. And if you look, plants don't really absorb green light very well. And so, I often ask questions, students a question like, what color do you think plants use to do photosynthesis? And a lot of students think it's green, but it's actually not green. The plants absorb all of the other colors, and they reflect green back. Which is why the photosynthetic parts of a plant appear green. There's lots of different pigments, but there are two main types, chlorophylls and carotenoids. Chlorophyll A is the main pigment in plants. It's the only pigment that can act directly to convert light energy into chemical energy. And they're big at absorbing violet, blue, and red. Chlorophyll B is this accessory pigment that absorbs wavelengths that chlorophyll A does not absorb. So it kind of picks up what chlorophyll A doesn't. Porphyrin ring is this ring structure with alternating double and single bonds, and it's part of the chlorophyll structure too. Photons excite the electrons in the ring, and then those electrons are then shuffled away from the ring while they're still excited, and they have a lot of energy, so that an electron acceptor can pick it up. This is what the molecular structure of chlorophyll looks like. Carotenoids are these carbon rings with alternating single and double bonds too. They can absorb photons with a wide range of energy, so they absorb lots of colors. They also scavenge free radicals like electrons that are just kind of floating around, which is not good to have. So these act as a protective role. And then phycobilioproteins are important in low light ocean areas. It helps photosynthetic organisms there gather as much light as possible. Right. And so, fall leaf pigments in the spring and summer, all the pigments are active, and then in the fall, the plant will absorb some of its pigments, but leave some others behind, which makes it look red and orange. All right, so now we're going to look at the process of photosynthesis in some detail. Light is captured by these things called photosystems, each of which consists of two components. This antenna complex, so that you can gather enough photons and feed that light energy to the reaction center, right? Which is the other part. And the reaction center is one or more chlorophyll molecules, and it passes excited electrons out of the photosystem. So read this about the antenna complex, but I think it's helpful if we kind of look at it now. So this is the thylakoid membrane here, and so this is the thylakoid membrane here. This photosystem, we're only looking at one at a time. There's two of them kind of attached together, but so we're just looking at one of them right now. But this is where we're looking when we're talking about this. This is one photosystem here, and this is the antenna complex, this whole thing out here. And a photon of light comes down, and when it strikes these little molecules, it excites their electrons. And so these electrons get excited, and they get bounced around from molecule to molecule until it reaches this thing called a reaction center. Now, the reaction center can take that electron in its excited state, and it will pass it up to an electron acceptor. And this electron acceptor will then send the electron down an electron transport chain. So this is a little bit about, how light is striking the antenna complex. Here's an electron donor. Here's an excited chlorophyll. It passes the electron acceptor, electron over into the electron acceptor, and then the electron donor comes back again. The electron donor in this case is water, by the way. So plants will take water and split it. And when they split the water, they produce two electrons that the photosystem can use. But it also produces oxygen as a byproduct, which is why plants give off oxygen. So the light-dependent reactions, you have this photon of light being captured, energy is transferred to the reaction center, and then those electrons move through carriers to reduce NADP+, which means that they pick up electrons. And at the end, they're going to produce ATP in a protein that we've talked about before. So in cyclic photophosphorylation, it means, and we're going to look at non-cyclic too, but in cyclic photophosphorylation, you have a photon come down, excites electrons, they get passed to the reaction center, it gets passed to an electron acceptor, where when the electron releases its energy, and this is kind of like a graph, so if we're up here, we're talking about high energy. So as the electron moves, it releases energy. It drives some ATP production because it's releasing energy to do this. And those electrons get passed back to the same photosystem. Now, this is not the most common type of reaction. So cyclic photosystems do happen, and plants will do them if you don't water them enough. But if a plant has plenty of water, it will do what's called non-cyclic photosystem or electron flow. Right. So yeah, there's evidence for two photosystems, but we don't need to see that. Photosystems 1 and 2 transfers electrons ultimately to NADP+, producing NADPH. Electrons that are lost from photosystem 1 are replaced by electrons from photosystem 2. Now, unfortunately, when we look at this, photosystem 2 kind of happens first, and photosystem 1 happens second. And we name them photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 because of the order of discovery. Well, this is non-cyclic electron flow, and it looks pretty complicated, and there are a lot of steps to it, but we're going to break it down, and you can listen to this part over and over again, and we'll also talk about it in class too. So photosystem 2, once again, again, we're still talking about this is photosystem 2 and this is photosystem 1, and we're on the membrane here, and we're going to look at some things that happen, and we're going to talk about where the electrons are going and what they're doing. So here's photosystem 2. It receives a photon of light, excites those electrons. Those electrons get passed to the reaction center, where they will pass those electrons on to an electron transport chain. Now, this electron transport chain is just like well, not just like, but it does the same job that the other electron transport chain does, which means that it pumps protons from one side of the membrane to the other. Now, when those protons get pumped across, they're going to flow through ATP synthase, which is the same thing we saw before. Well, meanwhile, these electrons are getting passed down to photosystem 1, where a photon of light strikes them. They get energized again. They get passed up to the reaction center, where they flow down through, but instead of going through another proton pump, these electrons get picked up by NADP+, right? Those empty dump trucks. So they get picked up and hauled off to the Calvin cycle. This is the words where we just talked about, photosystem 2 and 1. This is the whole thing, right? So this is photosystem here. Here's a photon of light striking this photosystem, exciting the electrons. These electrons get passed up here, across down to the electron transport chain. This thing is pumping protons across. This is photosystem 1. Photon of light re-energizes the electrons. Those electrons get passed over here, where they get picked up by the dump truck. And it's pretty simple. I mean, it looks complicated, but if you just think about photon excites electrons, those electrons then power a proton pump, lose their energy, but they get re-energized here in photosystem 1, where they get passed over to this electron carrier. Now, the protons that we pumped this way will flow through ATP synthase, which is just like the ATP synthase that we find in our mitochondria. So the protons flowing through ATP synthase is called chemiosmosis, which is what we just talked about. NADPH is also non-cyclic, which helps us to produce ATP. Now, the ATP, right, So this ATP that we made here, this NADPH that the plants made there, are used to drive the Calvin cycle. You ever go to the grocery store with your parents when you're younger, or to some store, and they had those gumball machines out in the front? You know, you could turn the little dial, and if you put a quarter in and you turn the dial, you get a prize out, right? Well, just imagine that you put a quarter in, but you can't turn it takes energy to turn the dial. Well, you can't get a prize out. And that's kind of what the Calvin cycle is. You can read about the Calvin cycle here and there, but it's better for us to kind of look at it, I think. This is the wheel, right? So this is the gumball machine. This is the little wheel. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are the quarters that we put in. And the quarters that you put in, if you have enough energy to turn the dial, and it takes 12 ATP, 12 NADPH, and 6 ATP here. So that's 18 ATP and 12 NADPHs. Then you can get 2 molecules of this stuff called G3P, which plants can use to make glucose and other sugars. So that's why photosynthesis has 2 parts. This is the first part here, so we just backed up. This is where we're making ATP and NADPH with this energy from photons, and we're using that energy to spin this wheel, right? So I want you to take some time and look at this phase 1, 2, and 3. That's something you can kind of read on your own and read about what happens in phases 1, 2, and 3. But overall, carbon dioxide goes in. If you can spin the wheel, you can get G3P out. This is the relationship between chloroplast and mitochondria, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. They really kind of go hand in hand. They're 2 biochemical processes that, are kind of married through evolution. Well, sometimes if plants don't have enough water, and if you go back up here and look at this, electrons are being sent this way, and their electrons are being carried away. Right? So electrons are just being carried off over and over and over again. How do plants replace these electrons? Well, they replace them with water, and they take water and they split it. And when they split water, they produce oxygen as a byproduct. They produce some protons, but they give electrons. Well, if a plant does not have enough water, it does what's called photorespiration. Right? And if it doesn't have enough water, the plant will close its stomata. And if a plant closes its stomata, then oxygen builds up inside. Carbon dioxide can't get in, and so therefore carbon dioxide cannot enter into the Calvin cycle. But the problem is plants will keep spinning this wheel, but they won't put anything into the wheel, so they don't get any sugar out. But they're still spending their ATP and their NADPHs to spin the wheel, but if no carbons go in, no carbons come out. Well, if that's the case, then plants have these alternate methods of fixation. C3 plants are plants that fix carbon using only photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle. And there are, a lot of plants are C3 plants. There are C4 plants that add carbon dioxide to this stuff called PEP, and it has a greater affinity for carbon dioxide, so you don't bond your Calvin cycle molecules to oxygen. And there are CAM plants that will open their stomata at night, bring in carbon dioxide, and add them to molecules so that you can have them for later. It's just it's a method to reduce water loss through your stomata. So you can read about the C4 pathway and the CAM plants. Pineapples are, CAM plant carbon fixators. Cacti are too, which is why, they say, cactus have water inside them. It's not really water. That water is the organic molecules that those cactuses are using to store their carbon dioxide. And that is it for Chapter 8.